The story of the 6th Marine Regiment's elite scout sniper platoon, the 40 Thieves, did not begin on the blood-soaked beaches of Saipan. It began decades later in the quiet realization of a son. To the author, Frank Tachovsky was merely an old man in a wheelchair. He was a retired colonel whose wartime history was shrouded in the silence preferred by his generation. That perception was shattered by a single, impassioned encounter. Sergeant Yumka, a veteran who had served under Tachovsky, spoke with a reverence that bordered on awe. He painted a portrait of his former commander that defied the man the author knew. Yumka described a moment of pure, blinding heroism on Saipan, June 15, 1944. A Japanese tank, a hulking engine of destruction, had broken the Marine line. It was advancing directly toward the regimental command post. Withering machine gun fire swept the area, turning the beachhead into a slaughterhouse. While others froze, Lieutenant Tachovsky, or Ski, grabbed a bazooka. He sprinted through the tracer fire, a single man against armor. He destroyed the tank, an act Yumka insisted saved every Marine pinned down that day. This revelation transformed the wheelchair-bound elder into a ghost of the past. He was a myth made real. The subsequent discovery of Frank Tachovsky's footlocker was an accidental archaeological dig. Inside, the author found a historical trove. He found letters scented with rosewater and lilacs. He found official citations hinting at battles untold. He also found documents detailing the existence of a highly specialized unit. This was not merely a Marine unit. It was a proto-special operations force. It was born of the brutal necessity of the Pacific Campaign. The conventional infantry, trained for open warfare, was ill-equipped for the close-quarters fighting. The cave-riddled jungle environment defined the island-hopping campaign. The Corps needed men who could penetrate deep reconnaissance. They needed men who could disrupt enemy logistics and execute silent killing techniques. This need led to the formation of the Scout Sniper Platoon on January 11, 1944, at Parker Ranch, Hawaii. Its leader, First Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky, was a Mustang who had clawed his way up from buck private. He had a radical, almost heretical recruitment strategy. Ski knew that the best fighting men were not necessarily those with the cleanest records. He sought out resilience, resourcefulness, and psychological fortitude. He believed these qualities were often honed outside the rigid military structure. He actively looked for men who had done brig time for brawling or drunkenness. These individuals had proven they could handle themselves. They possessed a fierce, almost familial loyalty to those beside them. This ethos was simple. Ability trumped obedience, and character outweighed convention. Ski famously declared that bigotry was unacceptable. He emphasized that hesitation, fueled by prejudice, was a death sentence in the field. The 40 men Ski gathered were soon nicknamed the 40 Thieves. This name recognized their efficacy in combat and their light-fingered antics when it came to supplies. They were not the idealized heroes of Hollywood posters. They were ordinary Americans, former farm boys, laborers, and roughnecks. They were thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Their training at Parker Ranch was visceral and brutal. It emphasized the close-quarters, jungle warfare techniques essential for survival in the Pacific. This training transformed them into formidable, specialized killers. They learned to stalk, track, and kill with piano wire and car-bar knives. They were prepared for a kind of warfare that stripped away all notions of glory. Their story, forged in the crucible of this unconventional unit, became a testament to raw, unglamorous bravery. It became a testament to the profound truth that heroes are not born, but made. They are made one agonizing, violent choice at a time. The transformation of the 40 Thieves from a collection of resourceful misfits into a cohesive, lethal fighting unit was achieved through a training regimen as psychologically brutal as it was physically demanding. Their training was not about parade ground discipline, but about instinctual survival. They learned map reading and stealth. They crawled through miles of barbed wire and scaled unforgiving cliffs. All the while they mastered the Unertel-scoped Springfield rifle, accurate to 1,000 yards. Yet the deep bonding essential for survival often occurred away from the firing line. Evenings were spent in the humid Hawaiian air. They shared stolen ham, candies, and bourbon dispensed from an atomizer. This fueled drunken storytelling and the release of volatile energy. It was in these moments that the men's rough, pre-war edges showed. Walter Borowski and Alfred Jumke argued fiercely over their impoverished upbringings. An intoxicated Oliver Strombo disrupted a map-reading class, requiring Corporal Evans's mediation. The men's psychological hardening was deliberate and merciless. They were shown the documentary The Good Earth Runs Red. It was a graphic depiction of Japanese atrocities. The images were raw, visceral, and horrifying. They stripped away any lingering notions of sportsmanship. They replaced those notions with a cold, focused animosity. The Marines were advised, in the blunt language of Leatherneck magazine, to ignore the rules of fair combat. Their training incorporated Colonel William Kengler's Biddle method of knife and bayonet fighting. This was a brutal, stylized approach designed solely for silent killing. It was far removed from the classical styles of fencing. They practiced with piano wire, Ka-Bar knives, and specialized trench knives. They became terrifyingly proficient in the Black Death tactics. This shared, brutal conditioning forged an unbreakable brotherhood. It culminated in a grim, shared pact. Understanding the fanatical nature of their future enemy, the 40 men agreed that capture was worse than death. Roscoe Mullins, experienced in the dark arts of moonshine and knife fighting, vocalized their collective resolve. They would avoid capture at all costs. The philosophy of no man left behind was pragmatically rejected in favor of mission success and personal dignity. This was a chilling acceptance of the war's ultimate realities. As their training peaked, the unit was consumed by the pathological boredom that plagues all troops awaiting deployment. This ennui, combined with their ingrained resourcefulness, fueled the 40 Thieves' infamous light-fingered antics and unauthorized excursions. The author's later investigation into his father's past found its emotional anchor not in combat records, but in the shared memory of these illicit acts. When veterans like Bob Smots, Roscoe Mullins, and Marvin Strombo finally sat down to recount their trauma, the silence surrounding the killing only broke when the conversation pivoted to humor. Specifically, they spoke of the legendary pig roast. This daring raid on a nearby farm was a moment of pure, defiant levity. It was complete with Bill Napel and Wild Bill Emmerich retrieving a pig and Orozco preparing his special sauce. It was the memory of being a full-blooded bunch of very active Marines, as Ski intended, that finally allowed the survivors to open up. It helped them piece together the huge jigsaw puzzle of their shared history. The Marines' desire for levity led to unauthorized visits to Pololu. This village was designated off-limits due to suspected Japanese loyalty. Ignoring warnings about bubonic plague, the Marines sought ice cream, beer, and the company of women. An elderly woman there, whom they affectionately called Mom, secretly ran a radio transmitter. During one such excursion, Bob Smots, with his keen tracking senses honed on the Osage Reservation, discovered the transmitter. It was hidden beneath loose floorboards in the general store. A Chinese man, distrustful of the official authorities, provided the Marines with crucial intelligence. This intelligence detailed Japanese submarine resupply operations occurring weekly in the nearby canyons. This was intelligence the FBI's triangulation efforts had repeatedly failed to obtain. When General Robert C. Richardson, Jr. discovered the Marines' unauthorized leave, the situation became a major disciplinary crisis. Lieutenant Ski was summoned to face the fury of General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith. With characteristic resourcefulness, Ski skillfully presented the intelligence gathered. He reframed his men's actions, not as a transgression, but as an effort to investigate the very radio signals the FBI could not locate. Ski's political genius transformed a court-martial threat into a strategic asset. The intelligence proved vital. The transmitter was neutralized, and the canyons used by the Japanese submarines were mined. This disrupted their entire resupply network. Though the thieves received punishment, it was minor. They received guard duty that led to them pilfering officers' alcohol in a fox-in-the-henhouse scenario. The incident underscored their unique ability to achieve strategic ends through unconventional means. It even meant Emmerich and Orozco ended up in the brig on bread and water. Emmerich participated in a self-inflicted ear-piercing ritual that left him hanging from a wooden pole. The final, grim lesson before deployment was delivered not by the enemy, but by training itself. On the second day of practice landings, a disastrous exercise saw 2 tracked landing vehicles destroyed in a minefield. This resulted in the immediate death of nearly 200 men. Hundreds more were wounded. This massacre, occurring at 15:05 hours, was a stark, chaotic reminder of the sheer danger inherent in their mission. It underscored the fragile line between life and death. It showed the devastating consequences of flawed military operations. As the Marines boarded their ships on May 19, 1944, they left Parker Ranch behind. They carried not just their specialized weapons, but the profound, unsettling knowledge that death did not wait for the enemy to arrive. The long sea voyage aboard the USS Bolivar was less a passage and more a prolonged exercise in psychological attrition. Packed like sardines in a tin can, the men endured clammy, crowded bunks. They faced endless, slow-moving mess lines. The anticipation was a living thing, a coil tightening in the gut of every Marine. It challenged the myth of the fearless automaton. The strategic stakes were immense. Saipan, the Pacific bulwark, would place American bombers within striking distance of Tokyo. In the pre-assault briefings, the abstract map lines dissolved into grim reality. Colonel Risley quoted General Saito's vow to drive the American devils back into the sea. He predicted a fierce banzai charge. This professional dread was compounded by personal anxieties. Corporal Martin Dyer, a loner, had confided his premonition of death to Marvin Strombo. He debated the nature of courage. He engaged in cynical humor about the Corps' pamphlet instructions on avoiding pillage and disease. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky found solace in the flowery, fragrant letters from his wife Roxy. The young men debated faith and fatalism in the crowded hold. Smots, Kenny, and Tipton wrestled with the idea of divine intervention. Johnson and Yumka cemented a grim pact to support each other's families should the worst happen. The night of June 14th was dominated by a dead silence that did not induce sleep. It was broken only by whispered prayers and the soft clack of rosaries. Dawn broke on June 15, 1944. It revealed the red sky of morning backlighting the island's ominous black peaks. This was the condemned man's breakfast. It replaced the abstract notion of a cruise with the immediate reality of violence. The landing at 08:30 hours was a catastrophe of Japanese preparedness. As the Higgins boats bucked and bobbed through the surf, the Marines saw the enemy's meticulous planning. Every square yard of the beach had been taped out with red range flags. This guaranteed a murderous accuracy. Bullets began to ping off the landing ramps like popcorn popping. By 0900, the shallow water was a bloody red, strewn with mounting casualties. The Marines were forced to bail out into chest-deep water. They scrambled over a 3-foot-high coconut log wall that provided momentary inadequate cover. The initial small arms fire soon intensified into a shattering artillery and mortar barrage. Veterans described the sound as hundreds of deafening freight trains passing overhead. Whining and whistling, mortars crescendoed into eruptions of sand mixed with metal and flesh. The air filled with the smell of sulfur, fuel, and burning bodies. The psychological toll was immediate and devastating. Lewis, the Marine burdened by the 40-pound SCR 300 radio, froze on the ramp. His mind was shattered by the unrelenting noise. He later experienced a complete mental breakdown, screaming and running in a frenzy. This was a grim testament to the cumulative trauma of the Pacific War. Despite the chaos and the staggering 35% casualty rate, the 40 thieves methodically secured their section of the beachhead. They used satchel charges to eliminate well-placed pillboxes. New recruit Tipton achieved his baptism by fire. The beachhead was tenuously secured by nightfall. The Japanese forces, however, were far from broken. As dusk settled, forward patrols observed large groups of enemy streaming down from the hills. General Saito, convinced enough Americans had landed, unleashed his full defensive fury. At 0300 on June 16th, the night exploded with an eerie bugle call. It signaled the massive banzai charge. Thousands of shrieking Japanese soldiers, brandishing swords, crashed into the American lines. The Shermans, which had arrived just before dusk, proved critical. They helped stabilize the beachhead and turn the tide against the overwhelming assault. The assault left over 700 enemy bodies littering the blood-soaked ground. The thieves, however, knew that armor required constant innovation. When Japanese tanks continued to threaten the lines, Philip Johnson devised Molotov cocktails. He drew inspiration from a radio show. These improvised weapons, crude but devastating, proved uniquely effective against the vulnerable Japanese armor. Their most critical early action came during the defense of the airstrip. Outnumbered and exhausted, the 40 Thieves single-handedly repelled multiple enemy attempts to retake the vital position. They disabled a truck to create a makeshift roadblock. They endured intense fighting amidst the deafening cacophony of artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire. This tenacious defense, repelling attacks in the pre-dawn hours and again in the mid-afternoon, demonstrated their critical, outsized role. Small, highly motivated units could achieve strategic objectives. Innovation and sheer bravery could overcome numerical disadvantages in the savage landscape of Saipan. The advance inland was a grinding, agonizing process. It was measured in yards, not miles. The Marines were fighting for elevation, pushing toward the island's strategic spine. This meant reaching Mount Tipopale and ultimately the 1554-foot peak of Mount Tapachau. This high ground was the Japanese Empire's Pacific bulwark. It offered perfect defensive lines carved into the dense jungle, jagged coral, and sheer rock facades. Every meter was contested. The devastating effectiveness of the Japanese defense was laid bare in the ravine where K Company was decimated. Well-concealed machine gunners and riflemen inflicted heavy losses. Often firing from spider holes and impossibly camouflaged positions, they turned the advance into a bloody crawl. This tragedy forced a critical shift in strategy. It necessitated the need for deep, clandestine reconnaissance. The 40 Thieves were the answer. Blackened with boot polish, wearing sniper caps instead of helmets, and armed with Ka-Bar knives, they launched night missions behind enemy lines. Their stealth was uncanny. They infiltrated the area near Tipopale, utilizing phosphorus-marked trees for silent trail markers. They were a disruptive force. They gathered crucial intelligence that allowed American artillery to eliminate enemy encampments and soften the bulwark. But the cost of unrelenting combat was about to be paid in full. On June 22, 1944, 7 days after the landing, Bobby Jean Smots led his squad toward a ravine where K Company had been shattered. Smots was the 18-year-old tracker from the Osage Reservation. He moved cautiously, battling a dark premonition. The air was thick and unsettlingly still as they entered a box canyon. This was an open area hemmed in by sheer walls and dense vegetation. The silence, a stark contrast to the constant cacophony of the front lines, was terrifying. Smots caught the faint, distinctive odor of the Japanese soldiers. It was a scent of cologne mixed with rice. The trap sprang just as he noticed the smell. 4 Nambu Type 92 heavy machine guns, the dreaded woodpeckers, opened fire. They unleashed sheets of bluish-white flame. The Marines were caught in a brutal, inescapable crossfire. The mission was a disaster. It was exacerbated by a fatal disconnect between the front and the rear. Lieutenant Ski's crucial request for phosphorus shelling to clear the dense terrain had been denied by higher command. This lack of support contributed directly to the devastation that nearly wiped out Smots' squad. It killed his friend Orello and left Evans mortally wounded. The psychological toll of the ambush, coupled with 2 weeks of fighting in filth, malaria, and dysentery, broke the men's composure. The rage, grief, and exhaustion found a horrific outlet. Battered Marines, returning from the box canyon, encountered a sight that seemed to mock their sacrifice. Army intelligence non-commissioned officers in the rear echelon, clean and sheltered, were feeding Japanese prisoners pineapple and canned peaches. The perceived insult ignited a terrifying breach of discipline. A Marine, eyes wide with the trauma of watching his comrades die, executed the prisoners on the spot. The Army non-commissioned officers were aghast. They instantly threatened a court-martial. Ski materialized instantly, his face a mask of fury that eclipsed their own. He stood squarely between his men and the shocked non-commissioned officers. His voice was low and dangerous. "You watch my men die day after day while you feed the enemy pineapple," he challenged. He looked at the army men, and then back at his exhausted, trembling Marines. "My Marines are worth more than a court-martial," he snarled. He was daring the non-commissioned officers to press the issue. He demanded his troops control their emotions. He paraphrased Kipling that the key to survival was keeping one's head when all about were losing theirs. The incident laid bare the raw, brutal calculus of battlefield justice. It showed the chasm between those who fought and those who administered. The brutal fighting continued relentlessly. It culminated on July 7, 1944, in the final desperate paroxysm of Japanese resistance. Driven by General Saito's desperate message to Tokyo, and fueled by the Bushido Code, thousands of soldiers stampeded forward. They were shrieking the war cry of 7 lives to repay our country. This was the massive Banzai charge. It was an overwhelming tidal wave of flesh and steel that nearly annihilated 2 army battalions. Machine guns firing continuously in the choking heat, overheated and froze. Marine artillerymen leveled their 105mm howitzers to fire point-blank into the charging ranks. The air was sickeningly overwhelmed by the cacophony of machine gun fire. It was filled with the shrieking cries of Banzai and blood. It was filled with the terrible sound of swords hacking flesh. In the midst of this chaos, a Japanese tank broke through the line. It was spewing a sheet of red flame. It was the moment Sergeant Yumka would forever remember with a cold dread. "We were goners," he later recounted. The machine gun fire from the tank was pinning down the entire unit. It was threatening to collapse the American position entirely. It was a hopeless situation. 1 man against armor, fire, and steel. In that defining moment, Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky, Ski, grabbed a bazooka. He ran through the withering fire, disabling the tank and killing the crew inside. This heroic, selfless act saved his unit from annihilation. It cemented his legend among the Marines who called him Ski. Despite the immense human cost, the American momentum was irreversible. The cost included the death of Lieutenant McLeod, the executive officer, killed by a sniper on June 23. The eventual fall of Mount Tapachau allowed the Marines to consolidate their position. It provided the strategic high ground necessary for the final offensive actions downhill. The battle's climax had been reached. It paved the way for the eventual declaration of Saipan as secure on July 9. This was a victory built on the brutal, often unglamorous courage of men like the 40 Thieves. The declaration of Saipan as secure on July 9, 1944, did not usher in peace. It merely replaced one kind of horror with another. The final act of the island campaign was not a military engagement. It was a profound collective psychological trauma witnessed by the surviving Marines. At Marpi Point, the northernmost tip of the island, the fanatical propaganda instilled by the Japanese government achieved its most devastating result. American soldiers watched helplessly as thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians chose mass suicide. They were terrified by the promise of torture and rape at the hands of the Americans. The cliffs became a stage for unimaginable tragedy. Mothers, driven mad by fear, hurled their babies into the churning sea before following them down. Families walked hand in hand into the ocean to drown. The sound of the surf was punctuated by the terrible wet thud of bodies hitting the rocks hundreds of feet below. This spectacle of mass self-destruction deeply scarred the American soldiers. It was the ultimate, desperate outcome of the Bushido Code. They had never conceived of warfare on this scale of psychological desperation. The sheer, relentless sight of this human waste left the Marines in a state of moral shock. It confirmed that the war they fought was not merely tactical, but existential. Against this backdrop of ultimate dehumanization, the small acts of Marine compassion shone through. While the Japanese command had instilled terror, the Marines worked to coax Chamorro civilians out of the caves. The Marines, including Roscoe Mullins and Dyer's squad, offered aid and protection. They saw starving natives drinking their own urine, terrified and broken. They responded with simple humanity. This contrasted sharply with the Japanese atrocities that the civilians had witnessed, such as hangings and throat cuttings. Dyer, the bare-chested Marine who would soon fall, carried small children to safety. This was a striking image of protection amidst the carnage. It proved that even in the heart of hell, the human spirit could resist the pull toward brutality. There was, however, no time for reflection or recovery. The conquest of Tinian, only 14 miles away, was mandatory. Despite the 6th Regiment having suffered the highest casualties on Saipan, the exhausted 40 Thieves were immediately deployed. The men, worn down by 2 weeks of filth, dysentery and sleepless nights, felt they always drew the short straw. The Tinian operation, commencing July 24, employed a brilliant, guileful feint. It was known as the MacArthur Landing. Instead of assaulting the obvious heavily fortified beaches, the Marines landed on 2 small, unexpected stretches of beach. This minimized casualties and concluded the battle within a week, but the victory was hollowed out by loss. The true cost of Saipan was visually and emotionally confronted at the 2nd Marine Division Cemetery. Under a mournful grey sky, thousands of white crosses stood in silent, ordered rows. The dedication ceremony was a stark, overwhelming reminder of the 3,000 dead and 13,000 wounded. For the survivors, the sheer scale of the sacrifice was too immense to process. They mourned the thousands of names misspelled on graves and the lives of Evans, Arello, and Kenny. They mourned the eventual paralysis of Joe Dulcich. The battle for the Pacific was won, but for the 40 Thieves, the war had just begun. The victory, the accolades, and the return home could not erase the toxic byproduct of their experiences. They carried the war within them. It was a lifelong internal struggle that defied the neat, heroic narratives of the home front. The combat skills that had kept them alive were lethal liabilities in civilian life. These included hypervigilance, instinctual violence, and the acceptance of death. The psychological toll manifested in terrifying ways. Veterans like Roscoe Mullins relived the horrors nightly. He wrestled with the promise he had made to a Japanese captain. Bob Smots, the quiet tracker, feared he was beyond forgiveness. He suffered nightmares so vivid he nearly attacked his own brother, mistaking him for an enemy in the dark. Frank Tachovsky, the leader who had held the unit together, could not share his bed with his wife Roxy. He found himself more comfortable sleeping in a chair. He dreamed of the dark figure of war that stalked him. The invisible scars were passed down too. They were evident in the wild screams of Yunker's children, who inherited the unspoken trauma of their father's past. Marvin Strombo, scarred by shrapnel and lifelong pain, would spend decades seeking a personal peace. This culminated in his eventual fulfillment of a promise to return a Japanese captain's flag. It was a quiet gesture of reconciliation, years after the final shot was fired. Decades later, the author Frank's son began the agonizing